Mel Gibson never imagined what would happen that day while walking down a busy street in Los Angeles with his Bible in hand. He stopped at a park to pray, seeking a moment of peace away from the noise, a pause to give thanks and reflect. But what started as a simple prayer ended in an event that no one could explain. The people who were there claimed that something out of the ordinary happened, something that defied all logic, a moment that stayed etched in their memories as an inexplicable testimony. But the big question is, did they really witness a miracle, or was it just a coincidence? Mel Gibson was sitting on a park bench in Los Angeles, with his Bible open on his lap. He wasn't looking for attention, just a moment of reflection and connection with God. But that afternoon, peace wouldn't last long. A few meters away, a group of young people was walking together, laughing and talking amongst themselves. It didn't take long for them to notice the unmistakable figure of Mel. Amid whispers and knowing glances, they began to approach with clear intentions, 8 in total young people full of skepticism and mockery. Their expressions reflected defiance. When they reached him, the first provocation quickly came. "Look, here's the defender of religious fantasies," one of them said with a sarcastic tone. "Mel, how does it feel knowing that millions believe in your stories?" another added with a mocking smile. Mel raised his gaze. There was no anger in his eyes, no fear, not even annoyance. He gently closed the Bible and, with unwavering calm, responded, "Faith is not a story, it's a gift." The laughter erupted among the young people. To them, faith was just an illusion, something from the past, an outdated belief. One of them took out his phone and began recording, as if it were a spectacle worth sharing on social media. "Come on, Mel," said another with laughter. "Do you still believe in those stories? Not even kids buy that." But they didn't settle for just words. One of them, with a challenging gesture, moved closer and tried to snatch the Bible from his hands. It was a quick moment, a sudden movement, but Mel's reaction was immediate. He held the Bible firmly without hesitation. The atmosphere shifted. A sudden gust of wind shook the leaves of the trees, as if nature itself were reacting to the situation. For a moment, the noise of the park seemed to quiet, and time slowed down. Then Mel stood up. Without raising his voice, but with undeniable authority, he lifted the Bible and proclaimed, "This book is not just paper. It is life, it is love, it is hope, and I will defend it always." The wind blew stronger. For the first time, the young people didn't know what to say. Something about the way Mel spoke those words left them in silence. But what happened next was something none of them expected. The air changed without warning. A warm breeze began to blow, different from any other breeze of the day. It wasn't a common gust. It had presence, weight, a force that seemed to come from somewhere deeper. The leaves of the trees were violently stirred, spinning in spirals in the air as if dancing in response to something invisible. The sun, until then hidden behind the clouds, broke through the gloom. A beam of light descended upon Mel Gibson, illuminating him. The Bible in his hands reflected that glow as if it suddenly had a life of its own. It wasn't just paper. At that moment, it seemed to radiate something bigger, something impossible to ignore. The young people who had been mocking him were now silent. The laughter vanished from their faces. One of them, with wide-open eyes, raised a finger and pointed at the sky. What's happening?" No one had answers. There was only astonishment, uncertainty, and something none of them had ever felt before. The wind continued to intensify, but in a strange way, it didn't blow across the entire park, only around Mel. It was as if an invisible wall surrounded him, a barrier of energy protecting him from the rest of the world. His hair and clothes were fluttering, but he did not move. His gaze remained fixed, his expression serene and firm. And then he began to pray with a strong voice, yet filled with love and mercy. He lifted his eyes and spoke to God in the midst of that inexplicable scene. "Lord, illuminate these young people and teach them that your love is greater than any mockery. Fill them with your peace and transform their hearts." At that instant, something even more surprising happened. From the sky, a white dove descended. It didn't flutter or sway in the wind. It simply came down with an impossible grace, serene and determined. With an almost symbolic gesture, it landed on Mel's Bible. The park fell into complete silence. Not even the wind could be heard anymore. The only thing that remained was an overwhelming sense of divine presence. The young people, who moments before had been arrogant and mocking, were now pale. Their eyes reflected awe. Some took a step back, unsure of how to process what they were seeing. But on their faces, something more than fear began to emerge. It was a spark of doubt in their convictions, a first flash of something they had never considered possible. The air was filled with something indescribable. It wasn't fear, it wasn't confusion. It was a presence, a peace that enveloped everyone there. The wind had ceased. The dove remained perched on Mel Gibson's Bible, and the young people who had been mocking just minutes before now stood in silence, their gazes fixed on the man who, without shouting or arguing, had given them the answer they didn't expect. It was then that one of them, the leader of the group, the one who had most insistently tried to humiliate him, broke the silence. But this time his tone was no longer defiant. It was trembling, filled with a doubt he had never dared to admit. "How can you believe in something you can't see or touch?" he asked, as if that were the last barrier between him and the truth before him. Mel looked at him with the same serenity he had maintained from the start. There was no anger in his expression, not even a hint of pride. He didn't need to prove anything because what was happening spoke for itself. With a firm voice, yet full of conviction, he replied, "Because even though you don't see it, you can feel it, and even though you don't touch it, it transforms you." The response hung in the air like a truth that could not be refuted. But what happened next was even more shocking. One of the young people, who until then had remained in the background, placed his hands on his face. His breathing became erratic, and in a barely audible whisper, he murmured, "I don't know what's happening, but I feel something inside me, like something I've carried all my life is fading away." His shoulders began to tremble, and to everyone's surprise, he broke into tears. The reaction spread like a wave in water. An older woman, who had been observing from afar, placed a hand on her chest and, with a choked voice, whispered with unshakable fervor, "God is here. I can feel it." It was as if an invisible fire had touched their souls. Several people in the crowd began to kneel spontaneously, not out of obligation, not for spectacle, but out of a genuine need to surrender to something greater than themselves. Some of the young atheists, those who had mocked Mel Gibson just minutes before, fell to their knees beside him, tears in their eyes, feeling for the first time an emptiness filling inside them. The transformation was real not through words, not through arguments, but because at that moment, something inside their hearts had broken to make way for something new. Mel Gibson observed them in silence. He knew that what was happening was not his work. He had only spoken the truth, but it was God who was touching those hearts. And with a firm voice, yet filled with love, he proclaimed, "I didn't come here to convince you with words. God's love doesn't need to be proven with debates because it's already in you, waiting for you to accept it." The dove, which had remained still on the Bible, took flight. Its white silhouette soared through the sky, spiraling upwards until it disappeared among the clouds. The wind blew again, but this time gently, as if nature itself were confirming what had just happened. The park, which had once been just an ordinary place, had now become a sanctuary, and in the hearts of those young people, in the witnesses of every person present at that moment, something had changed forever. The silence in the park was absolute. The mockery had disappeared, doubt had given way to reflection, and on the face of the young man who had led the mockery, there were now only tears. His eyes were red, his breath ragged. For years he had mocked faith, challenged the idea of God, and despised those who believed. But at that moment, everything he had taken for granted was crumbling before him. With a broken voice, he looked at Mel Gibson and asked, "I've spent years mocking faith. How could God accept me after all this?" It was a question that didn't just come from his mouth, but from his soul. It was the cry of someone who had been seeking answers in the wrong place. Mel looked at him with infinite compassion. His eyes reflected understanding, mercy, truth, and with the same serenity he had maintained from the beginning, he replied, "God doesn't measure your past. He looks at your present and your willingness to change. Peter denied Jesus 3 times and still was forgiven. The words pierced the young man like an arrow of love and truth. His legs trembled, and unable to hold himself together, he covered his face with his hands and broke into tears. His shoulders shook with each sob. It was a cry of liberation, of healing, of someone who had finally found what he had always been searching for. The other young people, those who minutes before had laughed with him, now looked at him with different expressions. Something within them had also changed. The mockery in their eyes had disappeared. Now only astonishment remained, and something deeper, a spark of faith, was beginning to light up in their hearts. And then, as if the heavens themselves wanted to confirm what was happening, a voice broke the silence. "Look at the sky!" They all looked up at the same time, and there, above them, shining with vibrant colors, stretched a perfect rainbow. It hadn't rained. There was no logical explanation. It was simply there, covering the sky with its radiant light. The crowd reacted immediately. Some began to cry, others raised their hands to the sky, praising God. Spontaneous applause echoed, trembling voices whispered, "Thank you, Lord." And even those who had witnessed from a distance felt a chill run through their bodies. It was a new beginning, not just for the young man who had led the mockery, but for everyone present. Something had changed in the air, in their souls. God had manifested, and no one, absolutely no one, could deny it. The park remained enveloped in an atmosphere of awe and reverence. The crowd was still gazing at the sky, where the rainbow lingered as a silent testament to what had just occurred. Some were crying, others praying, and many were simply trying to process what they had just witnessed. But the impact of that moment wouldn't end there. Among the crowd, a believer who had been witnessing the entire event stepped forward. With a voice still trembling from emotion, he approached Mel Gibson and asked a question that would be etched in the memory of all. "Mr. Gibson, what message would you give to the world after what happened here?" Mel paused in silence for a moment. He looked around, observing the faces of those young people who had mocked moments before and now were moved to tears. He observed the people praying, the families embracing, the crowd that had witnessed something inexplicable. Finally, he lifted his gaze and, with unwavering firmness in his voice, responded, "Never underestimate the power of love, faith, and redemption. This world needs more hope and less division." His words resonated in the air. The crowd nodded. Some applauded, and others simply closed their eyes as if they had just received the truth they had been waiting for. What had started as a simple afternoon in a park had now become a global faith phenomenon. Was it a miracle? A mere coincidence? Opinions were many, but one thing was certain. No one who had been there left the same. Mel Gibson took one last look at the crowd. The sun was beginning to set, and the golden light illuminated the faces of those around him with an expression of deep peace. He uttered his final words before leaving. "Jesus awaits you with open arms. His love has no limits." And with that, he turned around and walked slowly toward the park's exit. He didn't need to say more. What had happened spoke for itself, and in the hearts of those who had witnessed it, the seed of faith had been planted, ready to bloom.